FORA.tv. The world is thinking.
China has come into organics in a very unique way that may actually be a model for developing countries around the world. I think probably most folks here are familiar with the three-tier system of so-called non-polluted foods, leading to the green food, the two standards of green, A and AA, leading ultimately to organic. What I want to just underscore here is that when you look at the preconditions for this, you recognize a couple of key factors aside from the ones that I mentioned on this slide. First, obviously there's been extremely high chemical inputs in Chinese agriculture. I don't think there's any doubt about that. Rampant stories of environmental degradation, farmer deaths from pesticides, consumer deaths from so-called poison food. Not to distinguish China from many other parts, but there's been an unusual density, particularly in southern China. And this in turn has created obviously a major reputational challenge, enormous distrust around the world. For example, Japan has had a ban on Chinese tomatoes. And China has needed to really respond by becoming proactive in demonstrating its seriousness to eliminate these threats, and thus the system that you see here. And I'll quickly walk through the history in just a moment. But I want to point to some other factors. Decimated soils I talked to before. There's no possible way to do enough justice to this topic. There's anybody who's traveled has seen it. The carbon matter in soils is basically non-existent. And while the Chinese are probably the most resourceful populace in the world, and in the history of the world, going back 4,000 years, in making a little go a long way, nevertheless, the soils themselves have really been beaten up. And the net result is not only that you haven't put, that we don't get the nutrient matter in to feed agriculture, but we also have lost enormous amounts of topsoil. And that has resulted in also a real devastation of wildlife, which in my business is called biological pest control. When you have a healthy food chain, and I'll show you one example of a very healthy chain in a minute, you realize you've got a whole host of natural predators that are not really there. There's also the eutrophication and death of fresh waters and estuaries from excess nitrogen runoff. And again, China does not have a lock on this one. Chesapeake Bay is dying. Gulf of Mexico is dying. We have the same problem here, but it's certainly been noticeable there. And then also the economic hardship facing Chinese farmers that I mentioned earlier. Though wealthier than 20 years ago, they're nevertheless poor by global standards. And these fossil fuel-based inputs that are required in the sort of modern intensive agriculture there are actually unaffordable for many, the smallest scale in particular. One consequence of the modernization in China of agriculture has been, for example, that machinery input grew by 16 times from when I was there in the late 70s to now. And pesticide use also peaked, but actually it's in fact dropped off because it's just less affordable now. And so the Chinese have, again, when you're looking at the opportunity for organic, you quickly recognize there's this inherent 4,000-year-old tradition of crop rotation, of diversified planting schemes, of intensive applications of whatever source of nutrients, including trash, whatever fertility they can find, reuse of crop straw. I mean, obviously nothing goes to waste. Legumes for nitrogen fixation, companion planting, all of these things, we're discovering them in the West. They've been going on there for thousands and thousands of years.